You're standing in a camp. It's 40,000 BC. The fire is still burning, the food is still warm, and the person who was talking an hour ago is lying on the ground, and they are not going to get up. There's no funeral home. There's no coffin. There's no priest, no paperwork, no group chat to break the news to. There's just you, the fire, and a body. And at some point, standing there, one of your ancestors looked at that body and thought something no animal had ever really thought before. Not "I'm sad," something much stranger than that. Something closer to "we can't just leave them here." This is the story of what ancient humans actually did when someone died. Not the Egyptian version with the pyramids and the gold. Not the Viking version with the burning boat. We're talking about the very first time a human being deliberately did something with a dead body instead of walking away from it. And why that single act might be the most important thing our species ever invented. Because here's the thing nobody tells you. The hard part isn't the grief. Grief is easy, in the sense that it arrives whether you want it or not. The hard part is the logistics. And the evidence for how our ancestors solved those logistics is genuinely one of the strangest trails in all of archaeology. Let's start with the problem. Because before you can have a funeral, you have to have a corpse, and a corpse in a hunter-gatherer camp is not a sad object. It is a hazard. Within a day, bacteria that lived peacefully inside that person's gut start breaking down the body from the inside. Within 2, the smell carries. And that smell travels a very long way across open grassland. Which means the body isn't just a body. It's a signal. It's a flashing neon sign telling every hyena, every leopard, and every scavenger within several kilometers exactly where the soft, sleeping, half-blind humans are. Leaving a dead relative in camp is not disrespectful. It's suicidal. So every other animal solves this the obvious way. They leave. The herd moves on. The pack abandons the spot. It is the correct answer, it is the cheap answer, and for almost every species on Earth, it is the only answer. So here's the first real question. Why are we the exception? Why is there one animal on this entire planet that looks at a corpse, understands the risk perfectly well, does the maths on predators and disease and smell, and then stays anyway? And the answer starts somewhere you might not expect. It doesn't start with us at all. Because our closest relatives don't fully walk away either. Chimpanzee mothers have been documented carrying their dead infants for days and in some recorded cases for weeks, grooming the body, brushing flies off it, adjusting it while they walk, long after it has stopped being anything a chimpanzee can help. Elephants do something even harder to explain. The researcher Karen McComb ran an experiment where she laid out different objects for wild elephants, skulls of various animals, pieces of wood, elephant ivory. The elephants consistently spent far more time investigating elephant skulls and ivory than anything else, turning them over with their trunks, running the tips of their feet across them. So here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind right now. Is that grief? Or is it just confusion, an animal that doesn't understand what death is, waiting for something that isn't coming? And the honest answer is that we can't fully know. But we do know the machinery. Social mammals bond through a set of chemicals, oxytocin chief among them, that make separation from a bonded individual physically unpleasant. That system doesn't have an off switch for death. It just keeps firing at someone who isn't coming back. Which means grief isn't a human invention. Grief is much older than we are. It's the standard issue cost of being a species that bonds hard. So the real question was never when humans started feeling something about death. The real question is when we started doing something about it. Which brings us to the question this whole video is really built on. How far back does it go? What is the single oldest grave anyone has ever found, and who was in it? The oldest candidate is genuinely staggering, and it comes from a cave system in northern Spain called Atapuerca. Inside it, there's a 13-meter vertical shaft that researchers named the Sima de los Huesos, the pit of bones. At the bottom of that shaft, they have recovered the remains of at least 28 individuals. They are roughly 430,000 years old. 430,000 years. To put that in perspective, our species didn't exist yet. These weren't Homo sapiens. They were an earlier population, ancestors or close cousins of the Neanderthals, and they somehow ended up in a place that is extremely difficult to fall into by accident. The argument for deliberate deposition goes like this. There are almost no carnivore remains mixed in, which you would expect if this were a predator den or a natural death trap. The bodies are overwhelmingly young adults, not the mix of ages a random accident produces. And lying among them was a single beautifully worked quartzite hand axe, unused, made of a stone that appears nowhere else at the site. The excavators nicknamed it Excalibur. So is that the oldest grave offering on Earth? Maybe. Or maybe it's a rock that fell down a hole. This is the part of archaeology nobody puts in the documentary. 400,000 years is an extremely long time to stay confident about anyone's intentions. Now let's make it weirder. In South Africa, there's a cave system called Rising Star, and deep inside it is a chamber you can only reach by squeezing through a gap about 18 centimeters wide. The excavation team had to be recruited specifically for being small enough to fit. Inside that chamber were the bones of Homo naledi. And Homo naledi had a brain roughly a third the size of yours. About the size of an orange. Lee Berger's team argued that these bodies were deliberately carried into that chamber, through total darkness, through a gap you have to exhale to fit through. Other researchers pushed back hard, and that argument is still very much unresolved. But sit with the claim for a second, because if it's true, it breaks something. It would mean you don't need a big brain to bury your dead. It would mean the impulse showed up before the intelligence we usually credit it to. Which is a genuinely uncomfortable idea, and uncomfortable ideas are usually where the interesting science is. Then, about 60,000 years ago in the mountains of northern Iraq, we get the most famous grave in the history of archaeology. Shanidar Cave. In 1960, Ralph Soletsky's team excavated a Neanderthal man and found dense clumps of ancient pollen packed in the soil around his body. Their conclusion, he had been buried on a bed of flowers. The world fell in love with this instantly, and you can see why. It rewrote the cavemen. The brutish, grunting Neanderthal of every cartoon suddenly became someone who picked wildflowers for his dead. It got into textbooks. It got into museum displays. It is probably the single most repeated fact about Neanderthals ever written. And then it fell apart. A researcher named Jeffrey Sommer pointed out a small problem. A burrowing rodent called the Persian jerd lives in that exact cave. Persian jerds collect flower heads and seeds and store them in their tunnels. In large quantities. Right where the pollen was found. So the most moving discovery in Neanderthal archaeology was possibly just a gerbil doing its groceries. Which is, I think, the most humbling sentence in this entire video. Except, and this is why I love this story, that is not where it ends. In 2020, a new team led by Emma Pomeroy went back to Shanidar and found another Neanderthal. They called this one Shanidar Z. And Shanidar Z was lying articulated, on their back head resting against a stone, in a shallow depression that appears to have been deliberately cut into the cave floor. The flowers may have been a rodent. The grave was not. And that's the lesson worth taking out of this whole field. The evidence gets overturned, and then sometimes it gets overturned back. Absence of proof is not proof of absence. It usually just means nobody has dug in the right place yet. By around 100,000 years ago, our own species is doing this unmistakably. At Kafse Cave in Israel, bodies were laid in prepared graves and covered in red ochre, a mineral pigment that had to be found, dug, carried, and ground into powder. In one of those graves, a child was buried with the antlers of a deer placed across the chest. Think about that object for a second. Deer antlers do not preserve a body. They don't feed anyone. They don't keep scavengers away. They serve no function whatsoever except meaning. That is a symbol placed on a child 100,000 years ago. And pay attention to that red ochre, because it will not leave this story alone. From Israel to Wales to Australia, across tens of thousands of years among populations that had no contact with each other whatsoever, humans independently reached for the same substance. A red mineral, ground down, spread over the dead. Nobody knows exactly why. But here's the most likely explanation, and it's beautifully simple. Red is the color of blood. Red is the color of the living. And humans who had never met each other all independently decided that the dead should not be left looking like the dead. Now here's a genuinely horrible question, and I want you to sit with how ugly it is because ancient humans answered it anyway. What is a dead child actually worth to a society that is starving? Not emotionally. Materially. In hours of work, in calories, in things you could have used to keep the living alive instead. We know the answer because roughly 34,000 years ago, a group of people wrote it down. Not in words. In ivory. Now let's talk about the moment this stops being a gesture and becomes an economy. Around 34,000 years ago, at a site called Sunghir in Russia, 2 children were buried head to head. With them, spears carved from mammoth tusks that had somehow been straightened, carved animal figurines, pierced fox teeth, and roughly 10,000 beads carved from mammoth ivory. 10,000. Experimental archaeologists have sat down with period tools and tried to make these beads to work out how long each one takes. The estimates vary quite a lot depending on the method, but even the conservative numbers put the total labor in the thousands of hours. Years of skilled work. Now remember when and where this is happening. This is an ice age. These are people living permanently close to starvation, in an environment that kills you for a single bad week. And they spent years of collective labor making clothing that they then put into the ground forever on 2 children who could never repay any of it. That is not decoration. That is a society standing up and announcing at enormous cost that these 2 lives mattered. And 34,000 years later, it is still by far the loudest thing anyone at that site ever said. Half a world away, humans arrived at the same conclusion through the opposite element. At Lake Mungo in Australia around 42,000 years ago, a woman's body was burned, and then her remains were deliberately crushed and burned a second time before being buried. It is the oldest known cremation anywhere on Earth. 2 populations on opposite sides of the planet, separated by an ocean and tens of thousands of years, both independently concluded that you cannot simply leave a person where they fall. One buried them under ivory. One gave them to fire. Neither walked away. And then there's the one that gets me. At a site called Ain Malaha in northern Israel, roughly 12,000 years ago, an elderly person was buried lying on their side. Their hand was placed on the body of a puppy. Not near it. On it. 12,000 years ago, before agriculture, before writing, before the wheel, somebody decided that the person they were burying should not have to go wherever they were going without their dog. If you want to know how old the things you feel are, that's how old. Now here's where we arrive at the uncomfortable part of the story, because I'd be lying to you if I only showed you the tender version. At Goye Cave in Belgium, researchers found Neanderthal bones from around 40,000 years ago covered in cut marks. Butchery marks. The long bones had been broken open the same way they broke open reindeer bones to get at the marrow. Same species. Roughly the same era. One group is cutting a shallow grave and laying a body in it with care. Another group is processing their dead for calories. And we do not know why. It might be famine. It might be ritual. Plenty of cultures have consumed their dead as an act of respect, not contempt. It might be both in the same winter. Which should tell you something important. There was never one single ancient human attitude toward death any more than there's one modern one. What there was everywhere we look is asterisk a response asterisk. Somebody did something. That's the pattern. Not tenderness necessarily. Just refusal to treat a person as nothing. So why should any of this matter to you? Genuinely. Why should you care that somebody dug a hole 400,000 years ago and put a rock in it? Because of what had to be true inside that person's head before they could do it. And this is the part that I think gets badly undersold. So what was actually being invented here? Because it isn't sentiment. We established that already. Elephants have sentiment. What burial requires is something much stranger and much harder. To dig a grave, you have to hold in your mind a person who no longer exists. You have to imagine a future in which they still matter. And then you have to act on that imaginary future, expensively, physically, uselessly, in a world with no spare calories, on behalf of someone who can never thank you, never help you, and never even know you did it. Psychologists have a name for the underlying ability: mental time travel. The capacity to leave the present moment and place yourself somewhere that isn't now. Endel Tulving called the awareness of subjective time chronesthesia, and it's one of the few cognitive traits that looks genuinely close to unique in humans. And a brain that can hold onto a person who isn't there is the same brain that can hold onto a winter that hasn't arrived, a hunt that hasn't happened, a river 2 valleys over, and a god nobody has ever seen. Absence is the whole trick. Every single act of planning our species has ever managed runs on it. Which raises a genuinely wild possibility. We usually tell the human story through fire, tools, and language. But it's at least arguable that the first properly modern thing anyone ever did was refuse to walk away from a body, and that everything downstream of imagination started as a refusal to accept a disappearance. There's a harder truth folded inside all of this, though, and it's worth saying plainly. Grief is not a malfunction. It isn't a bug in an otherwise well-designed system. It is the exact, itemized cost of having bonded that tightly in the first place. It's the bill that arrives for a species that only survived by needing each other completely. You do not get the fire circle without it. You don't get the shared food, the shared watch, the hands that pulled you out of the river without also getting the thing that happens when one of those people stops existing. The pain is the receipt. There has never been a version of this where you get one and not the other. And some of them refused to accept even the separation. At Çatalhöyük in Turkey, around 9,000 years ago, people buried their dead underneath the floors of their own houses. Under the sleeping platforms. They didn't take the dead out to a cemetery on the edge of town. They kept them in the room. You have inherited every part of this. The impulse to sit with a body instead of leaving. The need to put something in the ground. The way a funeral is very obviously not for the person who died. 34,000 years after Sunghir, we are still spending resources we can't spare on people who can't thank us, and we still can't fully explain why we do it. So go back to that first camp. The fire is still burning. The food is still warm. The body is still there. And somebody, we will never know their name or their language or a single thing they were thinking, kneels down in the dirt and starts to dig. They aren't solving a problem. They're inventing one. The first grave, the first symbol, the first stubborn human insistence that being gone is not the same thing as never having been here at all. And every single thing you have ever loved and lost, you have grieved with the mind that person built, on a night none of us remember, standing over someone they couldn't bear to walk away from. If you made it all the way here, you're exactly the kind of curious human this channel is for. So do an ancient human a favor. Hit that like button if you learned something today, and subscribe to Ancient Humans Stickwise. There is a whole buried world still waiting to be dug up, and we are only just getting started. I'll see you in the next